name is James Lawton Haney, and that was my father's name, so I am a junior. My father, however, was known locally not by James, but by Lawton. But I have used the name James or Jim most frequently.
When and where were you born?
I was born on July the 26th, 1932, though I consider myself a native of McDowell County. As a matter of fact, I was born in Lincoln County in the town of Lincolnton. My mother had grown up in rural Lincoln County, and she was a newcomer to McDowell County, and so she wanted to use the services of her family doctor back in Lincoln County, and so she went back there for my birth. And in those days, ladies were confined for 2 or 3 weeks after birth, and so I began my life there. But then I came to McDowell County, and that became my native home.
Jim, can you tell us how and when did your ancestors come to McDowell County?
Well, my Haney ancestors came in the person of a man named Charles Haney. His family originated in Scotland, but they had moved to what is now Northern Ireland and stayed there for some 50 years. And then in the 1870s, early 1870s, he immigrated to North America and landed in Charleston, went north to visit some relatives in the Philadelphia area, and there married an English girl. And after having served in the American Revolution, he migrated south, where he had done part of his military service, and eventually bought land here in what is now McDowell County in 1796. He later sold that land and purchased a piece of property in 1804, and that piece of property has remained in the family ever since. So that's the origin of the Haneys in McDowell County. My mother's family were from what is now Germany, a German state in those days known as Hesse-Darmstadt on the Rhine River in the midsection of Germany, south of the city of Darmstadt. And they immigrated to this country in the early part of the 18th century. Johann Peter Marsteller came here in 1737 and lived for some years in Pennsylvania, and then migrated down to Lincoln County here in North Carolina. And so my mother's family really predates the Haneys.
This isn't a question on here, and I don't know if you know the answer to it or not, but could you tell me how your parents met?
Yes. Their meeting, I guess, was a little bit unusual. They were, well, my mother was a late teenager at that time. My father was about 20 years old, and they met at a family reunion in Lincoln County. They had never met before, but they were in fact second cousins. And so out of that, their romance grew, and a few years later they married in 1931.
How many children did your parents have?
My parents had only 2 children, myself and my younger sister, Anne.
Where did you go to school?
Well, I went to the Glenwood School, which in those days was both an elementary and a high school. So for all of my 12 years of basic education, I attended the Glenwood School.
Was there anything you enjoyed at Glenwood School that you remember today as being something that you really liked?
Well, I guess I should say that I probably majored in extracurricular activities. Uh, Probably, I should say to my regret, because when I went on to college, I found that my education was somewhat deficient in terms of what it should have been. But I spent probably too much time editing the newspaper and the annual and participating in the different plays and all that sort of thing.
Now, who helped shape your vocational choices later in life?
Well, I suppose that one's parents always have a lot to do with this, but I think that my two grandfathers were the chief influences in terms of how my career shaped up. My grandfather Haney was very interested in history and in travel. He had served in the Spanish-American War, and in the course of that had traveled all the way around the world, from Cuba to the Philippines, and came home, and he was constantly keeping track of his buddies from the war years, and so he traveled all over the United States to Spanish War American conventions. And so I imbibed a kind of interest in travel from him, and he was very interested, he and his sister, in family history and local history, and I used to sit around and listen to them tell their family stories, and that got me interested somewhat in local history. My other grandfather, Elias Mosteller, from Lincoln County, also exercised an important influence. He was a farmer and a school teacher throughout most of his life, and I always remember my mother repeating things that he had said, and I think those things influenced me. He was always quoted as saying, don't be a follower, be a leader. And my mother tended to push me into leadership positions, which I was really too shy to take on. But my grandfather's influence, I think, came through there. And she was always telling me also that her papa had told her brothers, when you're choosing a profession, first of all, consider being a Lutheran pastor, and if you can't do that, then at least be an educator. And so her four brothers all became school teachers, and so that sort of affected my life in that I eventually became both a Lutheran pastor and an educator.
Where and what did you teach?
I began my teaching career in 1965 after I had served a Lutheran parish in Ithaca, New York for some years, and had gone to Yale University to get a PhD degree in preparation for teaching. And the position which I first accepted was at Concordia College, a Lutheran college in Moorhead, Minnesota. And as a matter of fact, while I had not intended to stay there long, I thought this would be a first assignment. I ended up spending 32 years teaching the history of Christianity at the college there. We had a very large religion department, and so I was able to specialize while I was there, and eventually the field that I carved out was the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, and so that led me into a new field of interest which I had not initially been engaged in.
Can you tell me about some of the experiences you had with your students, what you did with them over the years?
Well, I was fortunate, I think, in having on very bright students. And one of the most interesting and exciting aspects of my teaching was in connection with the international education program which the college sponsored and which I got in at the very beginning. And so for many years I took students to various locations in Europe on a study seminar which lasted for 5 weeks in the month of May. This program was strictly an academic program. In addition to lectures which I gave abroad, I also lined up lecturers in Europe so that the students received as many, or almost double the number of lecture hours they would have received in a course on campus, in addition to seeing all the museums and so on which were relevant to what we were doing.
When you mentioned Europe, there's also one country in particular that I'm thinking about that you were able to take students to, which is somewhat difficult for a lot of people to go to. Could you just tell me briefly about Russia, or taking students to Russia? If you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine. I was going to say, it's not something that would have been very easy for individuals to do, except in your capacity.
Well, when I first, I think that I took my first group to Russia the same year that President Richard Nixon first visited Russia. I remember that when we were in Moscow, they were making preparations for his visit. And in those days, it was difficult, particularly if you were attempting to study religion in the context of communism, which is what I was doing at that time. And the official travel agency, which provided guides for everyone who went into Russia at that time, wanted to have nothing to do with religion or religious sites. And so I had to sort of sneak around the official guide and arrange my interviews with Orthodox believers, priests, and so on, and also take them to important religious sites without the help of guides, and that was very difficult in those days. In later years, of course, things eased up somewhat, and eventually I made a very good friend of a young man and his wife. Well, I say young man, they were a bit younger than myself anyway, who had their home in Siberia. And that led to my visiting Siberia on 2 or 3 occasions. And eventually I even took one of my student groups out to Siberia for a week or 10 days to expose them to the Russian frontier.
Wanted to switch gears a little bit and come back to your time here in McDowell. And could you tell me about your experiences renovating historic homes?
Well, I suppose this was a carryover from my grandfather's historic interest. And back in the early 1970s, my parents owned a log structure which had been built by one of my great-great-grandfathers as a schoolhouse and a church on his property. And this house had been, or this building had been converted into a dwelling by my grandparents. They used it while they were building their farmhouse. But it had a long history. It was built in sometime before 1853. I say that because the documentation I have indicates that the first school sessions, which we have documented, were held in 1853 in this building. And it came to be known as the Oak Grove School and was indeed one of the predecessors of the Glenwood School. My father was not particularly enamored with this building, and so after his death, I saw that it was in a somewhat deteriorating condition, and so I came down a couple of summers from Minnesota and with some local help restored this log building. So that was my first restoration project. Then in 1986, by that time I had decided that Minnesota winters were not conducive as a place to live for elderly people, and I was thinking I might become elderly someday. So I decided I would try to come back to North Carolina, and so I purchased a home which one of my great uncles had owned. I bought it from a cousin, and it too was in a sad shape. And so I set about in 1986 in restoring that home. And that home is the Garden Oaks home, which was built by Abraham Garden, Gardin, and his wife. So that was my second major project. And now in recent months, I have started to restore the old Haney home, which was constructed on the property which my earliest ancestor, Charles Haney, had purchased in 1804. My great grandfather and his wife, Margaret Mosteller, built this house with the assistance of his stepson, John Mosteller, in the early 1870s. And it has been neglected for a number of years, and so I'm engaged in putting that back into prime shape. So I have, I guess this is my third restoration project, and right now I'm quite confident it'll be my last. But I think that these structures are important to the cultural history of McDowell County, as well as for my own personal interest. And so I think that this kind of material culture is a great help for helping young people particularly understand how their predecessors lived and the kinds of conditions under which they worked and carried on their lives. So I think it has some significance anyway.
Speaking of that significance, today we're sitting in the Historic Carson House here in McDowell County, and you've been working with this organization here for a while. Can you tell me about your work with it?
Well, yes. I'm a little bit hazy about dates with regard to when I first became active here at the Carson House. I think that it must have been in 2004 because it was just at the time that Miss Nina Greenlee unfortunately died. And so new leadership came into being here, and I had just been elected to the board at that time. My parents had been very interested in the Carson House many years before, when it was first opened to the public as a house museum. My father had become well acquainted with Miss Mary Greenlee, one of the founders of this house museum. So I was interested, of course, in old houses, having already restored one. And so I became active on the board, and then in 2008, I became chairman of the board, and so I have been serving as chairman of the board of Carson House ever since, which includes, of course, such things as presiding at meetings and trying to raise funds to support the ongoing work of the Carson House. But it also involves a great deal of hands-on work. One of my chief activities a summer or so ago was restoring the unusual marbleized effect on the walls of the dining room here in the house. So I spent a couple of months doing that, and saved the Carson House $6,000 or so by restoring this room, which we had estimates a restorer wanted to charge us that much. And I have had the pleasure of being involved in a couple of major projects here. This room in which we were sitting, the foundations had begun to give way several years ago, and we had to replace all the joists under this room and a major sill which supports the north wall here. And I was very much involved in that restoration project. And also about that time, we decided to restore the 100-year-old barn here on the property and turn that into a kind of agricultural home life museum. And so we received a grant from the Blue Ridge National Heritage to assist us in that. And so we have completed, well, I say completed because it's basically finished, but we continually add new things. Just this last year, we added a blacksmith shop to the exhibits that we already have in the barn. And right now, we're engaged in a major project. The Carsons were always public figures, and they were very much interested in civic life and were big participants in that. And so the Carson home became a very public place. So we as a Carson House board felt that we should do all we could to consider continuing that a tradition of public service to the community. And so this led us to plan for the erection of a pavilion here on the property, which we hope will be used by the community for everything from family reunions to concerts to crafts demonstrations, and our own educational program here in the community, which we hope to expand with this facility. We're calling it the Jubilee Arbor in honor of our 50th anniversary as a museum. And it will be dedicated to the Carson slaves, who were an important part of the Carson House history, because their work here enabled the Carsons to become public figures in civic life. And so this is a small way of honoring these enslaved African Americans.
Dr. Haney, you're a well-written person, and I was wondering today if you could share some of the examples of things that you've worked on, or the books and articles that you've written, journals. You'd be able to maybe just tell us kind of briefly about each of those?
Well, I don't want to bore you with all of my minor writing projects. I guess I'll begin by pointing to one of my early works. I have indicated earlier that my grandfather interested me in family history, and for a number of years I did research on the Haney and the Marsteller families, and particularly I have worked on the Marsteller family, and this is a book which I did, The Marstallers in Pfungstadt on the McDowell. This is a story of the family from the early 1500s up until 1750, because this family immigrated to the United States in the 1730s. And so I did an extensive work here of the history of the family for some 200 years in this small German town. And this led me to travel to that town, and fortunately the city archives and the Lutheran Church had extensive records which enabled me to draw upon those in telling the story of that family. My most ambitious project in the field of scholarly publishing and in my own field of the history of Christianity led me to write a book and to translate a book from Russian. And I chose to write about a man who was known as Archimandrite Makary Glucharev. He was the founder of what came to be known as the Altai mission in Siberia. He was a Russian Orthodox monk, a very well-educated man who founded a string of hospitals, educational institutions, and so on in the area where Mongolian tribes had settled in the southern part of Russia beginning in the 16th and 17th centuries. He worked in the 19th century. He was also a translator of the Old Testament from the original Hebrew into Russian. His translation, unfortunately, was not accepted until well after his death, because the official church opposed this, because the translation which had been used in Russia up to this time was from the Septuagint, a Greek version of the Old Testament rather than the Hebrew version. And so Archimandrite Glucharev became something of a outcast among in the official church, though he did a tremendous amount of work in extending the bounds of the church in Siberia and is very honored there. I say it was ambitious for me because my knowledge of Russian is minimal in terms of undertaking a work of translation, but I managed, and I wrote then a 75-page introduction to this translation of his life, because much of the original biography had been left out, which I thought was essential. And he was finally honored by the Russian Orthodox Church in the year 2000, just the year before I was able to publish my book. He was, he was declared a holy person, which is stopping short of sainthood in Russia. I think probably the works that you're most interested in are the things that I have done with regard to local history here in McDowell County. Some years ago, Ann Swan and I did a great deal of research on gold mining in McDowell County, After all, gold mining was the first industry in McDowell County. And so I eventually wrote this up, and we published a little book called Gold, Shining Dust in the Cultural History of McDowell County. A few people realize it, but in the 1840s, if we can trust newspaper accounts in Morganton, which was, we were part of Burke County at that, up until 1843, we find that there were some 5,000 people employed in gold mining here in the county. And that was actually the bulk of the population involved in some way. And we know from research here at the Carson House that the Carsons were heavily involved in gold mining. And other notable families, particularly slave-owning families, often rented their enslaved African Americans to work in the gold mines during the winter months when they were not employed in agricultural pursuits. So this was a very important aspect of McDowell County history. I became interested, of course, in the county history as a whole, and so I published a book which many people in McDowell County are now familiar with, McDowell County, North Carolina, 1843 to 1943. This is basically a picture book collected from sources all over McDowell County, and from the Carson House and from the McDowell County Library, as well as some private collections. And this is important, I think, in telling the story of the county. I might add that I guess it's my most popular book, since I think it's, the last I heard, had sold over 3,500 copies. A less widely distributed book grew out of the period when I was president of the Glenwood High School Alumni Association, and I suggested that the association should have a formal archives, and then the committee was appointed, and they helped me in writing this book, Glenwood School, progressing by fits and starts, 1904 to 1972. My committee that gave me a great deal of help by collecting photographs and spending hundreds of hours identifying all the people in these photographs. I did the narrative story of Glenwood School from its beginning up to 1972. And I think that narrative is important not only to graduates of Glenwood School, but it also sketches fairly clearly the history of education in McDowell County during that period. And so far as I know, this is the only history of a local school that has been published here in the area. This was published by the History Press in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's been a great seller, particularly among Glenwood High School alumni, which they have appreciated a great deal.
We're putting together some of the histories of different, we'll call them industries in McDowell County, of course, with the gold mining. Do you know any of the history of moonshining in our area? It's not a question particularly aimed at your history or background, but we're just asking people about that to just get a little bit more information, if anybody knows anything or has any recollections.
Well, I remember that Sheriff Clarence Poole, who was sheriff of McDowell County when I was, I think, in high school, was noted for his ability to track down local instances of moonshining and destroying stills. At an earlier date, back in the late 1800s and the 1890s and around 1900 in particular, Daniel Knipe, whose house has been noted as a historic home on Rutherford Road here in town. He was a federal employee here in western North Carolina, and his chief business was tracking down moonshiners. And from newspaper reports of that period, he was greatly feared because he was not only good at tracking people down, but he was a good shot with his gun, and moonshiners, according to newspaper reports, were terrified of Daniel Knipe and his ability to find illegal stills.
Jim, thank you for that information. Dr. Haney, thank you for talking with us today, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to reminisce. I'm afraid I've talked too much about myself, but that's what you asked me to do, and so that's what I've done.